Ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves at a dangerous crossroads in history. A silent campaign is unfolding before our very eyes, one not fought with tanks or missiles, but with words, narratives, and manufactured fears. Europe today is not merely debating policy or defense, it is actively preparing its public for war with Russia. And this is not an accident. It is the culmination of decades of choices, miscalculations, and ambitions. Ask yourselves, why is war presented as inevitable? Who benefits when peace is dismissed as weakness? These are the questions that demand our attention. If we are to make sense of the world we live in, the very first step is to question the narratives handed to us. Narratives are not neutral. They are constructed, repeated, and reinforced until they become the lens through which people see reality. Yet the truth is rarely so simple, and often it is deliberately obscured. When leaders, media, and institutions speak with one voice, insisting that war with Russia is inevitable, that Europe must prepare for confrontation, the greatest act of strength is not to nod along but to pause and ask why now, and why this framing. It is in that pause, in that refusal to accept the narrative at face value, that freedom begins. Because when people stop asking questions, they stop being citizens and become subjects of someone else's design. The art of preparing populations for war is not new. Before every great conflict, the public is softened, persuaded, and conditioned. They are told their adversary is aggressive and incapable of dialogue. They are told peace is no longer possible. This is not history repeating itself in some abstract sense. It is a pattern as old as power itself. From the First World War to the Cold War, the same techniques have been used: repetition, selective truths, and the constant appeal to fear. And fear, once planted, spreads faster than any rational argument. But here lies the first hook. If fear can be manufactured, so can courage. If fear is contagious, so too is critical thinking. The difference lies in whether we are willing to step outside the script we are given and examine who wrote it. The importance of questioning the narrative goes beyond skepticism. It is not about rejecting every claim or distrusting every institution. Rather, it is about demanding evidence, examining motives, and recognizing that the way events are framed is often more important than the events themselves. Consider how words shape perception. A Russian military exercise is portrayed as a threat. A NATO exercise is described as defense. When Russia voices security concerns, it is labeled paranoia. When the West does the same, it is called vigilance. These double standards are not coincidences. They are tools to shape the narrative of inevitability. The hook is simple. Once you recognize the imbalance in language, you begin to see the imbalance in policy. Those who question are often told they are naive, disloyal, or even dangerous. But ask yourself, who truly serves their country? The one who accepts every word without thought, or the one who dares to ask if their leaders are leading them toward disaster? Throughout history, it has been the dissenters, the doubters, and the skeptics who preserved the dignity of nations. The masses may cheer for war in the moment, but it is those who resisted blind conformity who were vindicated when the destruction was counted. This is why questioning the narrative is not only a duty to oneself, but a duty to society. Another dimension often overlooked is who benefits from the story we are told. Wars enrich some and impoverish others. Arms industries thrive. Geopolitical ambitions advance, and careers are built on crisis. Yet ordinary citizens are asked to pay the price in taxes, in freedoms, and sometimes with their very lives. When you hear that Europe must prepare for war with Russia, stop and ask who profits if this becomes reality. Who gains when Europe spends billions more on weapons instead of schools, hospitals, or innovation? Who thrives in chaos and who suffers in silence? The hook here is powerful. When you follow the money, you often find the truth hidden behind the narrative. By questioning the narrative, you reclaim your agency. Narratives are designed to make you feel small, powerless, and dependent on those who claim to know better. Yet the act of asking why dismantles this illusion. It reminds you that consent is not automatic, that legitimacy must be earned, and that the people still hold the ability to resist manipulation. The strongest societies are not those that march blindly into conflict, but those that cultivate citizens who demand answers before sacrifices are made in their name. So when you are told that confrontation is destiny, stop and think, is destiny truly decided, or is it being decided for you? When you are told peace is impossible, ask whether every path has truly been tried or whether peace was dismissed too early. When you are told your neighbor is your enemy, ask who wrote the script and who stands to gain if you believe it. Hooks like these are not meant to give you easy answers, but to sharpen your vision, to prevent you from sleepwalking into someone else's war. The courage to question is the first weapon of peace. It is the firewall against manipulation and the first step toward a future where Europe defines itself not by hostility but by wisdom. The choice, as always, begins not with armies or parliaments, but with people willing to ask one deceptively simple question: why? Europe once stood in the ruins of 2 catastrophic wars and swore to itself that such devastation must never happen again. The promise of never again was not just a slogan, it was the foundation for building a continent that would prioritize cooperation over confrontation, dialogue over destruction. Yet, as we look around today, it is impossible not to see the haunting shadows of history returning. The way Europe is being prepared for conflict with Russia is disturbingly familiar. History does not repeat itself in identical ways, but it does rhyme, and those who ignore its lessons are condemned to relive its tragedies. The hook here is undeniable the moment society begins to believe that war is natural, inevitable, or even noble. It sets itself on the same path that generations before us bled to escape. Consider the build up to the First World War. European nations, locked in alliances, convinced themselves that they were simply preparing for defense, that mobilization was necessary for deterrence. But the more they armed, the more mistrust grew until one spark in Sarajevo ignited an inferno that consumed the continent. Citizens believed the rhetoric, trusted their leaders, and marched to the front with patriotic fervor, only to be swallowed by trenches, gas, and mud. Millions died for a war that solved nothing and destroyed everything. The lesson is as sharp as it is painful. Once people accept the logic of inevitable war, peace becomes almost impossible to rescue. The Second World War was no different in its manipulation of narratives. Populations were fed propaganda, portraying neighbors as existential threats, entire groups as enemies to be eradicated, and aggression as necessity. The machinery of fear drowned out rational debate. Ordinary people who might have been neighbors, co-workers, or friends found themselves pitted against one another because the story they were told demanded it. This is the hook. Wars are not merely fought with weapons, they are made possible by words. It is language that turns suspicion into hatred, that transforms anxiety into mobilization. The parallels with today are chilling when you see Russia presented not as a complex nation with interests and grievances, but as a one-dimensional villain beyond negotiation. Europe's tragedy is not only in forgetting these lessons, but in refusing to apply them. After 1945, leaders promised to construct systems of collective security that would prevent rivalry from leading to war. Yet rather than integrating Russia into a European security framework, NATO expanded step by step, creating the very tensions it now points to as justification for confrontation. The cycle repeats. We build the conditions for mistrust, then use mistrust as the argument for why conflict cannot be avoided. History's warnings are not whispered, they are shouted through the graves of millions. The hook is clear. Europe is not only drifting into the danger, it is doing so with its eyes wide open, repeating mistakes it once swore never to make again. When leaders tell you that war is the only path, ask yourself why history offers countless examples of leaders who said the same and where it led their nations. When you hear that militarization is defense, recall how militarization has consistently created insecurity rather than stability. When you are told that peace is weakness, remember that peace built the prosperity Europe enjoys today, while war destroyed it twice within a single generation. These are not abstract lessons, they are scars carved into the continent itself. To ignore them is to betray the memory of those who suffered. The most dangerous illusion is the belief that this time is different, that somehow modern technology, global institutions, or enlightened leaders will prevent catastrophe even as they prepare for it. Yet the essence of war remains unchanged. It begins with fear, accelerates through escalation, and ends with destruction no one intended. The pattern is timeless, and so too is the responsibility to resist it. Hooks emerge everywhere if you are willing to see them. When you see mass mobilization of media against a single narrative, recall how propaganda once led millions into blind obedience. When you see diplomacy dismissed as appeasement, remember how easily peace efforts were undermined before previous wars. When you see ordinary people persuaded to hate, remind yourself that in the end, they will be the ones to suffer most. The true test of Europe's maturity is not how quickly it arms, but in how faithfully it remembers. To forget is to surrender to repetition, and to remember is to resist the manipulation of fear. The voices that once cried, "Never again," echo still, but they grow fainter each time Europe drifts toward confrontation without pausing to learn. If those lessons are silenced, then history will not only rhyme, it will repeat with a vengeance. Preparation for war does not begin on the battlefield, it begins in the mind. Long before the first soldier is deployed or the first weapon is fired, populations are conditioned to think in terms of confrontation. They are persuaded that conflict is unavoidable, that dialogue is futile, and that peace is unrealistic. This is the quiet power of psychological mobilization, the transformation of citizens into soldiers in waiting not by choice but by belief. This simple. If people can be convinced that war is destiny, they will accept it as if it were written in stone. Yet destiny is not written, it is manufactured. The greatest defense against this manipulation is to resist being conditioned for conflict. When Europe's leaders declare that Russia is an existential threat, that every action must be met with escalation, and that compromise is merely appeasement, they are not just preparing budgets for defense. They are preparing minds to accept war as natural. Narratives are repeated until they sink into daily consciousness. News cycles are saturated with stories of aggression, danger, and conspiracy, while any voice calling for dialogue is dismissed as naive or disloyal. This is how thought becomes uniform, how doubt is suppressed, and how societies surrender their most important weapon, independent judgment. The hook here is vital. Once you control perception, you no longer need to control reality. If people already believe war cannot be avoided, they will stop searching for alternatives. It is not difficult to see how this conditioning works. School children are taught simplified versions of history that frame Russia as perpetually aggressive, incapable of peace. Entertainment and media reinforce stereotypes, while political rhetoric portrays every move from Moscow as a threat. Over time, the image of the enemy is so firmly embedded that questioning it feels like betrayal. Citizens internalize the logic that security requires hostility. They prepare themselves psychologically for confrontation even before their governments prepare militarily. This is the tragedy. The battlefield is won or lost in the imagination long before it is contested on the ground. But here lies the counterweight. Conditioning works both ways. If people can be taught to accept war as inevitable, they can also be taught to demand peace as the higher form of strength. The hook is clear. Peace is not the absence of courage, it is the greatest test of courage. To resist the constant drumbeat of fear, to challenge the narrative that leaves no room for alternatives, requires more bravery than marching in lockstep toward destruction. Real courage is not found in following orders unthinkingly, but in daring to think when thinking is discouraged. Every generation has been told that its conflict is different, that its circumstances make compromise impossible. Before the First World War, leaders said the alliances and rivalries left no room for negotiation. Before the Second World War, the rhetoric of inevitable struggle drowned out diplomacy. Today, the claim is that Russia's nature leaves no possibility for peace. But this is the same conditioning at work, reshaped for the present but rooted in the same logic of inevitability. The hook that must not be ignored is this. Inevitability is the greatest illusion of war. Wars do not happen because they are destined. They happen because societies are convinced they cannot be avoided. The responsibility of every citizen is to break this cycle of psychological surrender. Ask yourself who gains if you accept war as a fact of life, who benefits when you no longer question the path set before you. Arms industries grow, geopolitical agendas advance, and elites secure their influence. But ordinary people, the very ones being conditioned, are the ones who will pay the price in lives, in livelihoods, in futures stolen by conflict. Refusing to be conditioned is therefore not only an act of self-preservation, it is an act of defiance against manipulation. Resisting conditioning does not mean closing your eyes to threats or denying reality. It means refusing to let fear dictate your worldview. It means insisting that peace be given the same energy, the same investment, and the same imagination as war. Conditioning works when societies are taught to see only one path forward. Breaking free means demanding that alternatives remain visible, credible, and pursued with determination. The hook that echoes through history is this: once people reclaim the right to imagine peace, they reclaim the ability to achieve it. In the end, the strongest societies are not those that accept war as their fate, but those that resist the mental chains that make war appear inevitable. To refuse conditioning is to remain human in a time when dehumanization is the prerequisite for conflict. It is to protect the mind before the battlefield, to guard the imagination before the trenches are dug. If people recognize this truth, then the march toward war loses its rhythm, and the cycle of inevitability begins to break. Wars are rarely fought by the architects who design them. The burden is not carried by the politicians who declare them, or the strategists who write the doctrines. It is carried by ordinary citizens who never asked for conflict in the first place. When we hear the constant refrain that Europe must prepare for war with Russia, we must stop and ask who exactly will bear the cost of such a path. This is not an abstract question, but a moral and political imperative. The hook is sharp. Those who make decisions about war will often escape its consequences, while those with no voice in shaping policy will be left to endure its devastation. The history of war is a history of this cruel divide. In the First World War, entire generations of young men marched into trenches at the command of leaders who remained far from the front lines. Those leaders spoke of honor, destiny, and sacrifice, while millions perished in mud and barbed wire. In the Second World War, civilian populations bore the brunt of bombings, occupation, and famine, while the architects of aggression sat in relative safety until the very end. Today, when elites speak about the necessity of confrontation with Russia, they will not be the ones whose homes are reduced to rubble, whose children grow up in fear, or whose livelihoods vanish overnight. The hook that history drives home is clear war is declared from above, but suffered from below. Consider the financial burden, the call for militarization, for vast increases in defense budgets, comes at the expense of citizens who fund these choices through taxes and cuts to essential services. Every euro diverted to armaments is a euro not spent on hospitals, schools, or infrastructure. Ordinary people are told this is the price of security, yet the question remains: security for whom? Is the average family in Berlin, Paris, or Rome safer because billions are funneled into tanks and missiles? Or is this security an illusion that benefits those whose power depends on perpetual confrontation? The hook here is unsettling. When people are asked to sacrifice prosperity for weapon, they should ask whether they are financing their own insecurity. There is also the human cost, the one that cannot be measured in budgets. If a war erupts, it will be ordinary families who lose their sons and daughters, cities that lose their future, and communities that are shattered for generations. Those who advocate escalation speak of strategy and deterrence, but they rarely speak of the broken lives that follow. They reduce human suffering to statistics, collateral damage, or necessary sacrifices. Yet, for those who experience it, there is nothing abstract about the loss of a home, the death of a child, or the collapse of a way of life. The hook is powerful. Every war that is spoken of in lofty geopolitical terms translates directly into personal tragedies for countless ordinary people. It is essential to recognize that the price is not only paid during the war, but long after it ends. Nations scarred by conflict carry the wounds for decades. Economies collapse, social trust erodes, and entire generations are defined by trauma. The elites who orchestrated the conflict move on, write memoirs, and secure positions in history, but the ordinary citizen inherits ruins, and the next generation must rebuild on fragile foundations. This is the cruel reality. Those who pay the price of war do not have the luxury of moving past it. Their lives are defined by it. When we hear the call to prepare for war with Russia, we should remember that those urging escalation are often insulated from its consequences. They live in secure enclaves, send their children to schools far from conflict zones, and maintain careers that thrive on instability. Meanwhile, the people of Europe, the very ones being told this is for their protection, will be the ones to suffer if war becomes reality. The hook that must strike home is this: when the drums of war beat loudest, it is never the drummers who march to the front, but those who are compelled to follow. The truth is that citizens hold more power than they realize. By recognizing who truly pays the price of war, they can begin to resist narratives that demand sacrifice without accountability. War is not destiny, it is a choice. And the ones asked to pay for it must have the courage to say that their lives, their families, and their futures are not bargaining chips in a geopolitical game. The refusal to accept this burden blindly is itself an act of defiance, a rejection of manipulation, and a demand for a different path. The hook is unmistakable. When ordinary people refuse to carry the cost of elites' ambitions, the entire machinery of war begins to lose its fuel. It is always easier to declare war than to declare peace. Anyone can beat the drums of conflict, summon enemies, and speak the language of fear. It requires no great wisdom to escalate, no profound vision to destroy, but to pursue peace when the atmosphere is saturated with hostility. That is a rare form of courage. Real bravery is not found in those who shout the loudest for confrontation, but in those who insist on dialogue when dialogue is ridiculed. The hook is sharp. It is far easier to conform to the herd crying for war than to stand apart and demand peace. And it is in that act of standing apart that true leadership reveals itself. Throughout history, societies have confused aggression with strength. Leaders who march armies forward are praised as decisive, while those who advocate restraint are dismissed as weak. Yet, look deeper, and you see the truth inverted. It is the warmonger who takes the easy path, riding the wave of fear and resentment. It is the peacemaker who must swim against the current, risk ridicule, and face accusations of betrayal. When all voices demand escalation, the one who calls for negotiation risks isolation. This is where courage must be redefined, not as the willingness to destroy, but as the determination to preserve. The hook lies here. To defend peace is to take the harder road, the one that requires vision beyond the passions of the moment. Consider how quickly dialogue is framed as surrender. Any suggestion of compromise with Russia is dismissed as weakness or appeasement, as though speaking is equivalent to capitulation. Yet history shows that diplomacy is not cowardice, but civilization's greatest achievement. Wars end at negotiation tables, but how many lives are lost because diplomacy was dismissed too early? To sit across from an adversary, to seek common ground, to imagine coexistence when fear demands separation, that is not weakness, it is the essence of strength. The hook is undeniable. Only those secure in their convictions dare to negotiate, while the insecure cling to force as their only language. True courage lies not in destroying enemies, but in preventing enemies from being created. Every war begins with the dehumanization of the other, with the insistence that coexistence is impossible. Courage is found in rejecting this conditioning, in refusing to see another nation only through the lens of threat. It takes strength to imagine that dialogue might succeed where conflict would fail, and it takes vision to believe that future generations deserve better than the inheritance of war. The hook is piercing. Real strength builds bridges that endure. False strength burns them and leaves only ashes. We must also recognize the moral dimension of courage. It is easy to send others to fight and die. It requires no personal sacrifice to call for escalation from the safety of political office or media studios. But to advocate for peace often means facing personal attacks, accusations of treachery, or charges of naivete. It means risking reputation to prevent others from risking their lives. This is why advocating for peace is the higher form of courage. It demands sacrifice without glory, struggle without applause. The hook here is timeless. The bravest individuals in history are often those vilified in their own time for resisting the rush to conflict, only to be vindicated once the ruins of war make their warnings undeniable. Redefining courage as the pursuit of peace also reshapes the idea of sovereignty. A sovereign nation is not one that endlessly mobilizes for war, but one that can decide its own course without being trapped by fear or manipulation. Courage is sovereignty in action, the ability to say no to those who insist there is only one path forward, the path of confrontation. Courage is the refusal to let outside powers dictate Europe's destiny through narratives of inevitable conflict. The hook that strikes deepest is this: peace is not passivity, it is agency. To choose peace is to seize control of one's future rather than surrendering it to the logic of escalation. If Europe is to avoid disaster, it must reclaim this definition of courage. It must honor those willing to speak for peace with same respected reserves for those who advocate defense. It must understand that strength is measured not by how loudly it threatens, but by how wisely it avoids catastrophe. The greatest leaders are remembered not for the wars they waged, but for the peace they preserved. And it is this legacy that will define whether Europe becomes a battlefield once again or finally becomes the bridge it always claimed to be. The hook is final and urgent. It takes no courage to march toward war. It takes courage to resist the march. The destiny of Europe cannot be written solely in the halls of NATO or dictated from Washington. It must be claimed by the people who live on this continent. For too long, decisions about war and peace have been framed as technical matters, the domain of experts, strategists, and distant policymakers. Yet when the guns fire, when the bombs fall, it is not the strategists who pay the price, it is the citizens. This is why reclaiming ownership of Europe's destiny is not just a political principle, but an existential necessity. The hook is unavoidable. If ordinary people do not shape the future will be shaped for them by those whose interests are not their own. Europe faces a choice between becoming a battlefield or a bridge. To be a battlefield means resigning itself to perpetual confrontation, defined by hostility toward Russia, bound to strategies that turn the continent into a front line rather than a home. To be a bridge means recognizing its unique role as a meeting point of civilizations, as a space that can connect rather than divide. The problem is not that Europe lacks this potential, but that its elites increasingly refuse to imagine it. They are invested in a narrative of inevitability, a narrative that locks the public into believing that conflict is unavoidable. The hook is sharp. The future belongs not to those who accept inevitability, but to those who refuse it. Ownership of destiny begins with rejecting the illusion that Europe's security must always be outsourced. The idea that only NATO can guarantee peace strips Europe of its sovereignty and reduces it to a subordinate actor in global affairs. This dependency ensures that European interests are often sacrificed to transatlantic priorities. The public is told that submission brings protection, yet what it often brings is vulnerability to policies they did not choose. Real ownership means demanding a European security order that includes all Europeans, including Russia, rather than treating one of the continent's largest nations as a permanent outsider. The hook here is powerful if Europe cannot define its own security. It cannot define its own future. Another dimension of claiming destiny lies in refusing to accept fear as the foundation of politics. Leaders thrive on fear because fear silences debate. When citizens are told that danger is constant and existential, they will often trade away sovereignty, prosperity, and even freedom in exchange for the illusion of safety. But a society that defines itself through fear loses its creative potential. It becomes reactive rather than visionary. This is why reclaiming Europe's destiny requires courage to step outside the shadow of fear and demand that hope, dialogue, and cooperation guide policy. The hook is timeless, and nations built on fear collapse, but nations built on vision endure. Citizens must also understand that neutrality, dialogue, and independence are not signs of weakness, but of maturity. A Europe that constantly defines itself in opposition to Russia is not sovereign. It is reactive, forever tied to a single external reference point. A truly sovereign Europe is one that can engage all sides, pursue its own interests, and refuse to be reduced to the role of a pawn in someone else's geopolitical game. The hook is compelling. The ability to say no to the pressures of escalation is not weakness, but the very essence of sovereignty. Ultimately, ownership of destiny means remembering that Europe is more than its governments, it is its people. The public cannot be passive recipients of fear and manipulation. They must demand transparency, demand alternatives, and insist that peace be given the same legitimacy as war. The tragedy of the past was that populations accepted the inevitability of conflict because they believed they had no choice. Today, the challenge is to break that illusion and remind leaders that legitimacy flows from the consent of the governed, not from the dictates of geopolitical strategy. The hook is clear the moment people stop asking questions and start accepting inevitabilities. Their destiny is no longer their own. The future of Europe will be defined either by those who insist that confrontation is the only path, or by those who dare to imagine something different. To claim ownership of destiny is to reject the passivity of fear, to refuse the narratives of inevitability, and to demand that Europe live up to its promise of being a continent of peace rather than war. The question is not whether Europe can choose this path, it is whether its citizens have the courage to demand it. And the hook that lingers is this: destiny is never given, it is claimed, and if Europe does not claim its own, others will write it in its place.